They called him a madman when he spent 3 weeks spraying his own home with a water hose in the dead of winter. The town laughed as the ice grew 2 feet thick. But when the deadliest superstorm of the century erased their grid, nobody was laughing. They were begging for entry. The town of Oak Haven, Wyoming, sat nestled in a deep, bowl-like valley at the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. With a population of just over 900, it was the kind of place where everyone knew what you bought at the grocery store before you even made it to the checkout line. It was a town built on timber, stubborn pride, and a deep-seated distrust of outsiders. Arthur Pendleton wasn't exactly an outsider, but he certainly wasn't one of them. A retired structural engineer who had spent 3 decades designing deep-core drilling facilities and research stations in Antarctica, Arthur had moved to Oak Haven 5 years prior, seeking nothing but the quiet solitude of a log cabin on the edge of the tree line. He was a man of strict routines, quiet demeanor, and an unsettlingly sharp intellect. To the locals, he was just the eccentric hermit on the ridge. The whispers started in early November. Winter was approaching, but the old farmer's almanac and the local meteorologists at Channel 4 were predicting a milder-than-average season. The town was looking forward to an easy holiday, unburdened by the usual back-breaking snowdrifts. Arthur, however, was looking at different data. In his study, surrounded by humming servers and satellite weather downlinks he maintained from his polar research days, Arthur saw a terrifying convergence. A massive, stationary, high-pressure ridge over the Pacific was forcing a stream of tropical moisture directly north, where it was destined to collide with an unprecedented, historic low-pressure trough of Arctic air plummeting straight down from the North Pole. It was a meteorological nightmare, a hypercyclone, an atmospheric bomb that would stall directly over the Bighorn Basin. Arthur didn't panic. He prepared. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Arthur drove his beat-up pickup truck into town and parked outside Jenkins Hardware. Samuel Jenkins, a man who prided himself on carrying everything a man could need, stood at the counter as Arthur walked in and presented a list. Samuel adjusted his glasses, scanning the paper. "Arthur, you sure about this? 2 industrial gas-powered water pumps, 500 yards of heavy-duty reinforced hosing, and what's this? You want me to order you 3 tons of fine sawdust and wood pulp from the mill?" "That's correct, Samuel," Arthur said, his voice flat, gravelly, and entirely devoid of humor. "And I need it delivered by Thursday. Friday at the latest." Samuel chuckled, leaning heavily against the counter. "You building a paper factory up on that ridge, Arthur? Winter's going to be soft this year. You don't need to go hoarding. Just place the order, Samuel. Please." By Friday, the materials were delivered, and by Saturday, the town of Oak Haven had a new favorite source of entertainment. When the temperature dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, Arthur began his work. He rigged the water pumps to his deep water well, mixed the water with the massive piles of wood pulp into a heavy slurry, and began spraying the exterior of his home, layer by layer, hour by hour, in the freezing dead of night. He was utilizing a World War II-era concept called picrete frozen composite of water and sawdust that is incredibly strong, possessing a crushing strength rivaling concrete and melting far slower than pure ice. Arthur wasn't just freezing his house, he was entombing it in an impenetrable, thermally insulated armored shell. The spectacle drew crowds. People would drive up the winding ridge road, parking on the shoulder just to watch the old man in his thermal gear, holding a high-pressure hose, blasting his beautiful cedar cabin with a freezing brown slush. Mayor Thomas Gable and Sheriff Boyd Harrison decided to pay Arthur a visit a week into the project. The cabin was already completely unrecognizable. It looked like a massive organic glacier had swallowed the structure whole. The windows were entirely sealed over. Arthur had installed reinforced PVC pipes through the ice, acting as ventilation shafts, angled downward to prevent snow from entering. "Arthur!" Sheriff Harrison yelled over the roar of the gas generator. "Turn that thing off for a minute." Arthur slowly shut the valve, pulling down his frost-covered face mask. "Morning, Boyd." "Thomas." "Arthur, what in the name of God are you doing?" Mayor Gable asked, waving a gloved hand at the monstrous icy dome. "The Homeowners Association is having a fit, and frankly, folks think you've lost your mind. You're suffocating your own house. The moisture is going to rot the timber." "It won't rot," Arthur stated calmly. "The internal temperature is strictly regulated. This is a survival measure. A major atmospheric anomaly is going to hit this valley in exactly 12 days. The wind shears will exceed 100 miles per hour, and the temperature will drop to 60 below zero. The grid will not hold." Sheriff Harrison sighed, exchanging a tired glance with the mayor. "Arthur, I watch the weather every morning. We're getting maybe 3 inches of snow next week. You need to stop this. You're becoming a hazard to yourself. If there's an emergency, we can't even find your front door." "You won't need to," Arthur replied, turning back to his pump. "Because when it hits, my door will be the only one that opens. I advise you to reinforce the town hall, Mayor. The roof trusses aren't rated for the weight of what's coming." The men left, shaking their heads. By the next morning, the local diner was buzzing with the story. Waitress Betty Carmichael told everyone who ordered coffee about the Iceman of Oakhaven. They laughed. They called him a paranoid fool. They went about hanging their Christmas lights and stringing tinsel on the lampposts of Main Street, blissfully unaware of the dark purple mass forming on the deep radar satellites, churning violently as it marched south. Arthur finished his work 3 days before the storm. The ice armor was exactly 36 inches thick. He retreated inside through the single heavy steel bulkhead door he had installed, locking the massive dead bolts. He powered up his internal battery banks, stoked his custom-built wood stove, and waited in the quiet, absolute darkness of his frozen fortress. December 4th began exactly as the meteorologists predicted. A gentle, picturesque snowfall. Big, fluffy flakes drifted down over Oakhaven, blanketing the pine trees and dusting the rooftops in a perfect postcard-worthy scene. At the local diner, people kinked coffee mugs, joking about Arthur Pendleton suffocating in his ice cube up on the ridge. "Looks like the apocalypse is right on schedule," Mayor Gable joked to Sheriff Harrison over a plate of eggs and bacon. "I should drive up there and see if Arthur needs a snow shovel." But at 2 p.m. the sky changed. The soft gray clouds didn't just darken. They turned a bruised, sickening shade of violet black. The gentle flakes stopped falling, suspended for a brief moment in an eerie, absolute stillness. The barometric pressure dropped so rapidly that Betty Carmichael dropped a tray of glasses, clutching her ears in pain as they popped violently. Then the mountain roared. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a freight train accelerating down Main Street. The first gust hit the valley floor at 80 miles per hour. It ripped the Christmas lights from the lampposts, shattered the front window of Jenkins Hardware, and tore the shingles off the roof of the diner in a single devastating sweep. The snow that followed wasn't fluffy. It was granular, driving horizontally like buckshot. Within 20 minutes, visibility in Oakhaven dropped to absolute zero. The temperature plummeted from a comfortable 28 degrees to -15. Inside the police cruiser, Sheriff Harrison gripped his steering wheel, his knuckles white. He couldn't see the hood of his own car. The radio squawked to life, a frantic blast of static and panic. Boyd, are you there?" It was Mayor Gable shouting from the town hall. "I'm here, Thomas. What's happening?" "The swab station, the power just went out across the whole valley. The backup generator at the clinic won't start because the diesel lines flash froze. We've got people trapped in their cars on Route 9 and a wind is pushing the snowdrifts up to the second-story windows. Get everyone to the town hall." Harrison barked into the radio. "It's the largest building. It has the massive industrial gas heaters. I'll start running a chain-link line from the diner to the hall, so people don't get lost in the whiteout." For the next 4 hours, Oakhaven was plunged into a desperate, chaotic fight for survival. Sheriff Harrison and a few brave volunteers braved the lethal winds. tying ropes to waists, dragging freezing, terrified citizens from their homes and stranded vehicles toward the brick facade of the Oakhaven Town Hall. By 8 p.m., nearly 300 people were packed into the gymnasium of the town hall. The emergency gas heaters were roaring, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching cold. Outside, the storm had escalated into something monstrous. It was a weather event without precedent, a stationary polar vortex feeding off Pacific moisture, dumping feet of wet, heavy snow which was immediately frozen solid by negative 40-degree winds. Inside the hall, Mayor Gable paced nervously. The panic in the room was palpable. Children were crying, people were wrapped in whatever blankets they could find. "We just have to wait it out," Gable announced, his voice trembling slightly over a megaphone. "The brick will hold. The heaters have enough gas for 2 days. We just have to stay calm." But the building was dying. Above them, the massive wooden trusses of the gymnasium roof were groaning. The snow falling outside wasn't blowing away. The unique mixture of sleet, snow, and flash-freezing rain was accumulating at an impossible rate. Tons of solid ice were pressing down on a roof designed to hold a fraction of that weight. At midnight, a terrifying crack echoed through the hall, as loud as a cannon shot. Dust and acoustic tiles rained down on the screaming crowd. One of the primary steel-reinforced wooden beams had splintered. Sheriff Harrison shone his heavy flashlight up at the ceiling. The beam was bowing inward, entirely warped under the pressure. Another crack echoed, then another. "It's not going to hold," Samuel Jenkins whispered, standing next to the sheriff, his face pale with terror. "The whole roof is going to cave in. It'll crush us, all will freeze to death in minutes when the wind gets in." "We have to evacuate," Gable said, panic finally breaking his composure. "But out there, it's negative 45 degrees. In der Rest, the wind chill is negative 70. The mud. We step out there. We die in 10 minutes. Where do we go? The school is too far. The houses are already buried." A terrifying silence fell over the leaders of Oakhaven, broken only by the shrieking wind tearing at the brick walls and the agonizing groans of the dying roof above them. They had nowhere to go. They were completely, hopelessly trapped by their own lack of preparation. Then Betty Carmichael spoke up, her voice trembling. "What about the ridge?" Harrison whipped his head around. "The ridge? Betty, you can't be serious." "Arthur's cabin," she stammered. He said it was a survival measure. He said he built an armored shell. He told you, didn't he? He told you the roof wouldn't hold." And Scott. Mayor Gable swallowed hard. "It's a mile and a half up the mountain road. In this weather, it's a suicide march. Staying here is suicide," Betty cried out as another deafening crack echoed from the ceiling, causing a massive section of drywall to crash onto the gymnasium floor. The massive gas heaters flickered, their exhaust vents choked by the rising ice outside. A wave of bitter, killing cold swept through the room. Sheriff Harrison looked at the terrified faces of his townspeople. He looked at the buckling roof. He remembered the cold, flat certainty in Arthur Pendleton's eyes when he said, "When it hits, my door will be the only one that opens." "We link up," Harrison commanded, his voice booming over the chaos. "Every rope, every extension cord, every belt we can find. We tie ourselves together. We wrap the children in 3 layers. We leave in 5 minutes. We're going to the Iceman." The town that had laughed, mocked, and dismissed the paranoid engineer was now about to bet their lives on his madness. They formed a massive, desperate human chain, pushing open the heavy double doors of the town hall into the roaring, pitch-black maw of the storm. They stepped into the whiteout, a line of freezing, terrified souls, marching blindly up the mountain toward a fortress of ice. The darkness outside the Oakhaven Town Hall was absolute, a suffocating void of driving, razor-sharp ice. As Sheriff Boyd Harrison pushed the heavy doors open, The wind violently ripped them from his grip, slamming them back against the brick facade. With a sound like a gunshot, the temperature combined with the wind chill sat at a lethal -72 degrees Fahrenheit. The exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 3 minutes. A chain of 287 terrified people stepped into the void. They were tethered together by nylon tow ropes, heavy-duty extension cords torn from the town hall's utility closet, and leather belts tightly knotted together. "Keep moving. Do not stop your feet." Harrison roared through a battery-powered bullhorn, though the sound was instantly swallowed by the shrieking gale. "If the person in front of you falls, you pull them up. We do not stop." The mile-and-a-half trek up the ridge to Arthur Pendleton's property would normally take a casual hiker 30 minutes. Tonight, it was a grueling, agonizing descent into physical hell. The snow wasn't falling, it was moving horizontally, sandblasting their goggles and finding every microscopic gap in their scarves and coats. Mayor Thomas Gable, tethered near the middle of the line, was practically dragging his wife, Martha. Ahead of them, Samuel Jenkins from the hardware store was carrying a young girl, his heavy boots punching blindly into snowdrifts that were already waist-high. The cold bypassed simple shivering. It was a deep neurological agony that made muscles lock and lungs burn as if inhaling crushed glass. 50 minutes into the march, disaster struck. The line suddenly went violently taut near the back. A heavy gust of wind clocked later at over 110 miles per hour caught a group of teenagers, sweeping their feet out from under them. They slid toward the embankment, dragging Betty Carmichael and 3 others with them. "Hold the line!" Gable screamed, falling to his knees and digging his boots into the icy crust to anchor the rope. "Pull!" Harrison felt the sharp jerk from the front. He unclipped his carabiner, blindly following the rope back through the whiteout, his flashlight beam entirely useless, reflecting off the dense curtain of snow. He found Betty half buried, the rope cutting fiercely into her ribs. With raw, adrenaline-fueled strength, Harrison and Samuel hauled them back up onto the center of the asphalt road. "We can't make it, Boyd," Gable gasped, his face a mask of rime ice. "We're dying out here. We're almost there." Harrison lied. In truth, he had lost his bearings 20 minutes ago. He was navigating purely by the slight, burning upward incline in his calves. Another hour passed. It felt like a lifetime. The human chain was slowing down. Hypothermia was setting in. People were beginning to stumble out of a dangerous sleepy apathy rather than physical exhaustion. Then the incline flattened out. Harrison recognized the heavy silhouette of the ancient dead oak tree that marked the entrance to Arthur's driveway. "We're here!" Harrison bellowed, stumbling forward. "Arthur! Arthur! Arthur!" But as the sheriff dragged himself toward the coordinates of the cabin, his heart stopped. There was no house where Arthur's beautiful cedar cabin had stood just 3 days ago. There was only a massive, smooth, asymmetrical mountain of white. The picrete dome had completely blended with the landscape, catching the drifting snow to form a seamless artificial glacier. There were no windows, there was no porch, and most terrifyingly, there was no visible door. Panic ripped through the front of the line. The townspeople bumped into the solid wall of ice, beating on it with frozen fists, their screams muted by the howling wind. "Arthur!" "Arthur," Samuel Jenkins screamed, pressing his ear against the frozen wall. "Open up, please, God, open up." Harrison desperately swept his hands over the smooth, unyielding surface. The ice was as hard as granite. He drew his service weapon, considering firing a round into the ice to make noise, but realized the picrete would likely cause a lethal ricochet. They had marched 1.5 miles into a death storm, only to be locked out by the very armor they sought refuge behind. "Look!" Betty shrieked, pointing upward. Protruding from the top of the ice dome was a heavy, reinforced PVC pipe, Arthur's air intake vent. Harrison scrambled up the icy slope, tearing off his heavy outer glove. He found a large rock, protruding from a nearby snowdrift, hoisted it with both hands, and brought it down violently against the side of the PVC pipe. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythmic vibration traveled down into the bowels of the frozen fortress. 10 excruciating seconds passed. Nothing. Mayor Gable sank to his knees in the snow, weeping silently, the tears instantly freezing to his cheeks. They were going to die on Arthur Pendleton's front lawn. Suddenly, a deep mechanical groan resonated from within the ice. The ground beneath Harrison's feet vibrated. A hiss of intense pressurized steam erupted from a seam in the ice at the base of the mound. Arthur had embedded an industrial thermal heating coil around the frame of his entrance. The ice fractured with a deafening crack, fissures webbing outward. A heavy 6-inch thick steel maritime bulkhead door swung slowly outward, pushing away a ton of accumulated snow. Warm yellow light spilled out into the blinding blizzard. Standing in the doorway, framed by the steam rolling off the heated doorframe, was Arthur Pendleton. He wore a simple wool sweater and held a heavy flashlight. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look vindicated. He just looked calculating. "You're late, Boyd," Arthur said, his voice cutting clearly through the storm. "Get them inside. The thermal door lock can only stay open for 90 seconds before the ambient temperature drops the interior below safe levels. Move." The chaotic rush through the heavy steel door was a blur of frozen limbs, crying children, and gasping lungs. As Sheriff Harrison dragged the last straggler inside, Arthur slammed his weight against the bulkhead, locking down 4 heavy steel deadbolts and spinning a pressure wheel that sealed the cabin completely from the apocalyptic world outside. The immediate silence was deafening. The roar of the hypercyclone, which had assaulted their ears for hours, was instantly muted to a dull, distant vibration. The concrete shell, 3 feet thick and denser than concrete, provided absolute acoustic and thermal insulation. But as the townspeople stripped off their frozen masks and goggles, wiping the ice from their eyelashes, they stopped and stared. Arthur's cabin was not a cabin anymore. The interior walls had been stripped down to the studs and reinforced with heavy steel cross-bracing. In the center of the living room, a massive circular section of the hardwood floor had been cut away, revealing a wide industrial steel staircase leading down into the earth. "Downstairs, quickly," Arthur instructed, his tone clipped and authoritative. "The ground floor cannot support the weight of 300 people. Proceed to the sub-level." Dumbfounded, the town of Oakhaven descended into the earth. What they found below was a marvel of paranoid engineering. Over the past 5 years, Arthur hadn't just been living a quiet life of retirement. He had hired out-of-state private contractors to excavate a massive 3,000-square-foot bunker directly beneath the bedrock of the ridge. The cavernous room was bathed in the warm hum of LED strip lighting, powered by a massive bank of deep-cycle marine batteries lining the far wall. 4 high-efficiency wood gasification stoves pumped steady, radiant heat through a network of copper pipes. Along the walls were floor-to-ceiling metal racks stacked with military-grade MREs, massive drums of purified water, and essential medical supplies. It wasn't a panic room, it was a subterranean ark. Mayor Gable sat on a folding cot, staring blankly at the massive ventilation scrubbers humming softly in the corner. "Arthur?" Gable stammered, pulling off his soaked gloves. You built this for us." Arthur walked down the steel steps carrying a heavy medkit. "I built this because the mathematical probability of a catastrophic grid failure in a geographically isolated valley is a statistical inevitability. Humans have a fatal flaw, Thomas. They build for the weather they remember, not the weather that is mathematically possible." "Now." Arthur moved through the crowd, tossing thermal blankets and instructing people to huddle near the copper piping. 3 weeks ago, my meteorological models confirmed the atmospheric trough. I knew the town's infrastructure, specifically the roof trusses of the town hall and the unwinterized diesel lines of the hospital, would fail within 72 hours of the front hitting. I ordered the sawdust to create the pykrete shell to protect the ventilation shafts from the shear winds. The rest of this He gestured to the bunker. "I have been preparing since I moved here." Samuel Jenkins, warming his hands over a stove, looked up. "You knew we'd come. You knew we'd laugh at you. And you knew we'd end up knocking on your door anyway." Thou. "Pride is a poor insulator, Samuel," Arthur replied softly. "I do not care about being laughed at. I care about tensile strength, thermal dynamics, and survival. You are safe here. The air scrubbers will support this capacity for roughly 2 weeks. The storm will break in 4 days." At exactly 3:15 a.m., a low, guttural rumble vibrated through the bedrock beneath them. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy structural collapse that sent a shudder through the foundation of the bunker. Sheriff Harrison looked at Arthur. "The town hall," Arthur confirmed, checking a gauge on the wall. "The roof just failed. It has entirely caved in." A collective gasp echoed through the bunker. Had they stayed arguing about the cold, hoping the brick would hold, all 300 of them would have been crushed beneath tons of steel, wood, and solid ice. The town that had openly mocked the eccentric engineer now sat in his basement, breathing his air, alive solely because of his obsessive foresight. For 4 days, the superstorm battered the Big Horn Basin. Above ground, the hypercyclone flattened ancient forests, snapped utility poles like toothpicks, and buried the valley in 9 feet of compacted, concrete-hard snow. Inside the citadel of sawdust, a new society formed. There was no panic. Under Arthur's strict regimentation, the townspeople organized rationing, medical triage, and sleeping shifts. Mayor Gable quietly stepped aside, yielding absolute authority to the quiet man with the gravelly voice. Arthur didn't gloat. He merely managed the logistics of keeping 300 people alive in a sealed box. On the morning of the 5th day, the dull vibration of the wind finally ceased. Arthur checked his barometric gauges, nodded once, and walked up the steel stairs. Harrison, Gable, and a few others followed him closely. Arthur disengaged the heavy steel deadbolts and pushed the maritime bulkhead open. The sunlight that flooded the entrance was blindingly, violently bright. As they stepped out onto the ridge, the sheer scale of the devastation struck them dumb. The town of Oakhaven was gone. Below them, the valley was a smooth, uninterrupted bowl of glittering white. Only the very tips of the tallest church steeples and the highest chimneys poked through the catastrophic snowdrifts. The town hall was an unrecognizable mound of collapsed rubble, buried under tons of ice. The roads, the cars, the power lines, everything had been erased. But as they looked back at Arthur's home, the genius of the picrete shell was undeniable. The monstrous winds had scoured the ice dome, polishing it to a glass-like sheen. Not a single piece of timber had cracked. Not a single window was broken beneath the ice. The structure stood defiant, a frozen monolith of human engineering. Sheriff Harrison stood beside Arthur, looking down at the buried graveyard of their town. "We have nothing left, Arthur. We have no homes. We have no power. We're entirely cut off from the world." Arthur adjusted his jacket against the biting, crisp morning air. He didn't look down at the ruined valley. He looked at the massive group of people emerging from his bunker, blinking in the sunlight, holding their children alive. "You have a workforce," Arthur said flatly. "You have 300 able bodies. You have exactly 4 months until the spring thaw to dig out the infrastructure. And I have the blueprints for grid-independent geothermal housing on my servers down below." He turned and looked at the mayor and the sheriff. "The town of Oakhaven is gone," Arthur said, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. "So, we will build a better one." "Not hot. If Arthur's chilling tale of survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with a friend who needs a reminder to always trust their instincts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another incredible true story of human endurance. What would you have done in Arthur's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.